I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Mine is 40018. My sister was 40017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day.
I'm Trinity Johnson. In this week's episode, I'm joined by Ron Weitzenkorn, who's going to share about his family's experiences during the Holocaust, but we're also going to be talking about a very special memorialization project called the Stolpersteine, or Stumbling Stones, which is a really meaningful way of remembering victims of the Holocaust, and I'm so excited to share more about that with you, and welcome, Ron, to join us today. Thank you for being here. Sure. To get us started, will you share a little bit about, you've done an extensive amount of research in your family's story, even traveling to many of the sites connected to your family's legacy. Will you share what you've learned about your family?
Well, yeah, sure. So thank you for doing this, Trinity. So my family's history is tied in with Germany, and my father's from Germany. And I grew up with my grandparents about 4 blocks away, so I always heard about them being German and identify as a German Jew. And I heard a little bit about the Holocaust, the Shoah, not a lot. I knew my family suffered, but I didn't really understand it. Like a lot of families around the world, probably, the Holocaust wasn't really discussed until later. And as I grew up, I became more curious about it, and I went to Germany as an exchange student in the 70s and started to learn about my family history and do some family research and talk to my family about it. So the history is, my grandmother is from a town called Mayen, which is in the western part of Germany, sort of in the Moselle-Rhine area. The big city nearby is Cologne. And her family lived in this town for at least since the late 1700s. And so I was able to trace the family history going back a number of generations by contacting archives and talking to family members. And what I found in terms of what happened during the Holocaust is my grandmother's parents lived in my grandmother's father, Edward Zelenka, came from Prague, or from Czechoslovakia, actually, in the late 1800s, married my great-grandmother, Henrietta, and took over a shoe store from my great-grandmother's aunt, another Henrietta. And so this store is where they lived, and this plays a big role in the family history and the installation of Stolpersteine. So Edward and Henrietta, my great-grandparents, had 4 children. And my grandmother was the youngest of the 4. She married my grandfather, who was from a different part of Germany. He grew up in a rural area, fought in the First World War for the Germans, and was severely wounded, happily recovered, moved to this town because his sister was there, and basically met my grandmother and married and had 2 children. So that takes us up to about 1920, and then we go into the fate of what happened with the Nazis.
And how did their lives change when the Nazis?
So my grandmother always said anti-Semitism was not as bad in the 20s before the Nazis, despite economic turmoil in later years with high inflation and economic struggles. My grandparents did well. They had a second-hand Mercedes. They took skiing trips to Switzerland, the Black Forest. they were middle class and they were integrated in the community. My grandmother's oldest siblings, Elsa and Max, moved to Cologne and married and had children, lived lives there. And that wasn't too far away, so they'd see the family. And then my grandmother's closest sister, Martha, stayed at home and married a man named Herman Cohn, who again took over the shoe business. So it's the third generation running the shoe store. And that was just around the corner from where my father grew up. My grandparents had a clothing store specializing in knitwear. My grandfather had the rights to the quality knitwear called Blila, and sold knitwear and had a good life. When the Nazis came to power, that changed. So they came to power in January of 1933, and there was early on an economic boycott, and people were discouraged from shopping at Jewish stores, and people, guards or Nazis would be outside the store discouraging people or mocking people if they would go in. So it was a very difficult time. Things only got worse with all the Nuremberg laws and reduced rights. But in my family, my grandfather, as a German war veteran, felt strongly that this would pass, did not want to leave. However, my grandmother was very concerned and my father remembers arguments at the table about what to do. And ultimately, my grandfather agreed to do the paperwork to get a visa to come to the States. He had a couple of brothers who had moved to the States in the 1920s, and one of them had a connection with someone who agreed to sponsor the family. However, they still weren't ready to leave. They just had this in their back pocket. Schools were closed. My Uncle Paul was kicked out of the gymnasium, the high school, and my father was younger and went to the Jewish school, and that was closed. So my Uncle Paul was born in 1922, so he was about 16 at the time of Kristallnacht. My father was born in 1928, so he was about 9 years old. And Kristallnacht just changed everything. My father remembers hearing the boots and the breaking of the glass. He was scared. He ran upstairs, hid in the bathroom, was able to see out of the back window. They could look out behind, and he saw the synagogue in flames. It was a horrible experience for him. And I should say, Mayan had a large Jewish community for a small town. The town was maybe 10,000 people, I'm not sure. And the peak of the Jewish population was about 300 Jews. They had a synagogue. And about the time of the Nazis came to power in 1933, there were about 200 Jews there. And of course, then that changed, and people started leaving in the 30s. My grandfather was arrested on Kristallnacht and taken to Dachau. My father remembers the next morning, my grandmother gave him a note to run to their attorney. My father didn't know what the note was, and basically it was a note asking for help. And he remembers he knocked on the door, and the attorney said, "Tell your mother I'm sorry, I can't do anything to help you." My grandmother took the initiative and started negotiating with the officials. And I think it's one thing to understand about what was going on right now was that you hear about the final solution, which was the extermination of the Jews. This was not at that point. This was more force the Jews to leave, take their property, get rid of them. And that's basically what the goal was here with Kristallnacht. Certainly people died and there was violence, but it wasn't mass extermination. So my grandmother negotiated and said, "We'll leave, we have a visa, and we'll leave." And they had to agree to sell their home and store. They They lived in a 4-story building. The first floor was the clothing store, and then they lived upstairs in the top floors. That was November of 1938. My grandfather was released in December, and in March of 1939, they were able to leave.
Wow. And what do you know of their journey then to America? Did they come straight here? Did they have to go anywhere else? And also would love to know what their arrival story was.
They left. They had to go to Stuttgart, I think, and pick up the official documents, and then they went up, I think, up to the North Sea, and left and took a boat over and made it, I believe, in May, on the U.S. Manhattan. My father remembers arriving and seeing the Statue of Liberty and understanding what that meant, and they were met at the port by family. And they stayed with family for a short time and then got an apartment. It was very difficult. I mean, they were free and they were happy. They had the stress of other family members on both sides being there, not being able to get out. My grandmother's father was there. He was 80 years old, 79 years old at that time, not in good health. And other siblings on both sides of both my grandparents had family who wanted out, were having problems leaving. Economically, they struggled. My grandfather was a dishwasher, a Fuller brush salesman going around in an Italian neighborhood trying to sell brushes. But ultimately, it was an American dream story. They moved to Florida after about a decade, and my grandfather opened up a clothing store in a small town where I grew up, Dade City, Florida, and they thrived and did real well.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful rebuilding story. And I'm so glad, a Florida story, but glad that we have you here to be able to share that, and now a local connection to have to these experiences. What did you find out about extended family who were not able to escape?
Right. So that's of course a sadder story. We'll focus on my grandmother's side. My grandfather lost siblings too. On my grandmother's side, her older siblings in Cologne, Elsa and Max. Elsa, they lived close to each other and in a large Jewish community with a beautiful synagogue in Cologne. Elsa and her husband, Ferdinand Waller, had one son, Bernhard. He was able to leave and go ultimately to Chile. And of my grandmother's 3 siblings and their families, he's the only one who made it out. So that's really tragic. Ferdinand and Elsa were deported east and ultimately murdered. Max Zelenka, my grandmother's only brother, lived just a few blocks away from Elsa and family. Same story. He had a wife and 2 children. They were deported east and murdered. In Mayan, as I said, in the home where my grandmother grew up, and her father was still alive, as well as her sister Marta, who was married and had 2 children. Marta and her husband Herman and their 2 children were deported east to Poland and murdered in a concentration camp. My great-grandfather, Edward Zelenka, at age 82, they took the older Jews and put them in this home for a short period, and then ultimately most of them were sent to Theresienstadt, which is what happened in 1941, I believe, or 42, I'm sorry. And he lasted about 2 months there. He was old and fragile. I'm sure the sanitation was poor, the nutrition was poor, conditions were, I'm certain, horrible. And my grandparents received notification from the Red Cross that he had passed away at age 82. I mean, I view it as murder, basically.
I hear how painful that is, especially for family who, during the war, has no idea what is happening to their extended family. And I'm sure that's an unimaginable situation to know what's happening to your parents and your siblings. At what point did your family, or even if your father shared, does he remember really when the family figured out what happened to their family and how that news was received?
Well, as I mentioned, the Red Cross notified my grandparents. I think that may have been during or shortly after the war. The rest of the family, it was a mystery. My grandfather, as I said, moved to Mayan because of his sister Tilla and her husband, and they had 2 children, and they did make it out. They came over in July of 1939, so that was a blessing. The others, I found in my research, I found testimony from my family, different family members, my grandmother and grandfather. I think it was with the Red Cross after the war, asking what happened to these people. There was, I think, through Israel, there were some attempts to find people, and ultimately, they didn't really find out a lot of specifics. Basically, what was happening was they, for instance, Marta and her family went to a ghetto in eastern Poland, and then there were just different concentration camps, and as they empty out the ghetto, they'd send people to different ones, and we don't know which one they went to, but then they were exterminated there. That's all we know.
With such a tragic history and with how close you said that your family always was, how forthcoming were they? I know you've done an extensive amount of research, so you already know a lot of the story, but how much did you know before you really started looking into your family's story? How open were they with sharing what had happened?
That's an interesting question. My grandfather was able to move on, I think. It was very hard, even though he lost siblings and family. Some family members were bitter, of course, and justifiably so. My grandmother didn't talk a lot about it. My grandfather never talked about his experience in Dachau. It was too much. My grandfather had photo albums of the people who didn't make it. A lot of them were children, and he had that. And so we'd talk about that. Beyond that, the specifics weren't known. I didn't really understand how tight-knit the family was in Mayan until I started sort of digging into it. I think my Uncle Paul possibly talked about it more. He was older. He had a different experience. My father always said this. My Uncle Paul, just being 6 years older, so he was born in 1922. So that in his youth, before the Nazis came to power in 1933, he spent a lot of time with his grandfather. It was a very happier time, I think. My father, by the time he remembers things, there was already the pressure. He was 5 years old when the Nazis came to power, and so then there's all this pressure. So he had a much different childhood.
It was maybe shielded a little, too.
He was shielded.
So much younger.
He said he didn't know a lot, but it was also my great-grandfather would take my Uncle Paul out, and he basically trained him in the religion. My great-grandfather was very religious, Orthodox, and my father didn't get that experience because by then, I think it could have been illness as well. My great-grandfather was getting older, but Paul had a much closer relationship with his grandfather than my father. My father just remembers a grumpier old man and don't touch this. And Paul was very close, would go on a lot of nature hikes and go to the temple with him, that sort of thing. So it was just a different experience for my father.
Well, and I think as we are thinking about memory and how people are remembered, Stolpersteine, the project really that you've done so much work with in partnership with the artist in Germany, is such a meaningful and intimate way of remembering the lives of individuals during the Holocaust. And so to kind of transition to that project a little bit, because it is doing incredible work in remembering some of these individuals, right? That incredibly, you have a wealth of knowledge, but some of these stones are the only memories of a person, right? It's their name on what's called a stumbling stone. So before we really dive into kind of the meaning and the memorialization, can you tell us what is a Stolpersteine, or a stumbling stone? What's the idea? Because it really is such a beautiful way of memorializing.
It is, and I'll add. My wife always points out, for many of these people, they don't have a grave site. No one said Kaddish for them because they were just exterminated, and so it's a great memory. When the Stolpersteine were laid for our family was there, and we said the Kaddish for them. That's in essence the memorial for them. So the history of the Stolpersteine, or what a Stolpersteine is it's basically a concrete block, 4 inches by a cube, 4 inches by 4 inches, with a brass plate on it. It's individualized. Every one who is persecuted by the Nazis is eligible for one. So not just Jews, but other groups, Roma or Sinti, LBGT, political prisoners, anybody. And obviously a lot are for the Jews. They are placed in front of the last residence where that person freely lives. So not in a camp, but in front of their home. In May of 2023, the 100,000th Stolperstein was laid. They're in about 27 countries in Europe, many in Germany, of course, and it's in the local language. And it's the idea of stumbling is you stumble upon this, and it's a recollection. It's supposed to make you think and reflect. Oh, someone lived here. What's their story? And in many communities now, you can, there might be a QR code or something, and you can then read more about this person. So what it would say on a stone is, here lived. They all start here, or most of them start here lived. The person's name. If it was a woman, her maiden name, the year of birth and death, if they were murdered, and then their fate. Deported to so-and-so, or to, like my great-grandfather's is, deported to Theresienstadt, or murdered, and the fate, murdered. So, for instance, for my grandparents, my father and uncle, they fled. They weren't murdered. So people who were persecuted but didn't die are also eligible for them.
And I think one of the things that when people first hear of stumbling stone, right, and the idea of walking and they can be stepped on, it almost sounds like it's out of a place of disrespect a little bit. But one of the things that I find so beautiful, and you touched upon this, is that it's at the last residence, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very personal, and that's very humanizing. On the one hand, seeing multiple also gives you the scope of how many people were here at one time, right? But it's so individualized because each one is one person, as you said, with their name and their birthday, and then it's in their home, where their family was, where they were probably the last happy. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we're thinking of especially Stolpersteine, and I know they're controversial in some places, how I've learned about them through your family story and you sharing about this project with other people and helping other people identify, can my family get one of these memorial stones? It's just such a beautiful, individual, humanizing thing. And I'm wondering, because we'll talk about some of the trips you've gone when these stones have been laid or dedicated, but you also have met the artist, who I'm sure also went through various levels of really internalizing how to remember people. And I think, again, there's that surface of it's on the ground, we're stepping on it, versus really this deeper meaning. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of Gunter as a person, as an artist, and really what this project, this art installation is for him.
Well, it's a life's work. I mean, he started in the early 90s, so he's been doing it for decades. And he and his wife lay most of these stones, and it's just an amazing project. I think your point is his about the individualization. You can say 6 million people were murdered, and it's just hard to fathom. But when you can take it to the individual person and understand their fate, the horrors they went through, the suffering, the anxiety, I think an individual can grasp that and understand that, identify with that, learn from that. And I think that's his goal with this. He started out in Cologne doing a memorial to the Sinti and the Roma, and then expanded it into the current project. And he doesn't show a lot of signs of letting up either. He's in his early 70s now, or mid 70s maybe, and his wife's a little bit younger, and she's doing it too. So,
and my understanding is he doesn't like a lot of recognition either.
He's a very modest person, from what I can tell. Right? He has received awards, but he's a quiet man. He'll talk to you, but he basically goes about his business. They planned this, and yeah.
Do you know how he got started? Does he have a connection to this history?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know. He was an artist, and this, as I say, he started with the Sinti Roma memorial, and then expanded it.
So I think for people who are watching who may wonder, would my family be eligible, or could I have a stone laid? Can you talk a little bit about the process and how you actually get a stone? And most importantly, one of the things I've learned from you in sharing about this is not something that you have to pay for as part of your family's memorialization. And I think that's such an interesting and also very meaningful part of this project.
Right. I think the fascinating thing about how Demnig has organized the Stolpersteine project is that it's localized. So the initiative has to come locally, and it can come from different organizations. In Mayan is this school, the Karl Berger School, and they're just very interested in supporting the project, and I can get into that. In Cologne, it's the archives. An interesting thing is in Cologne, we found this out when we went to the ceremonies for the installation of Stolpersteine for my grandmother's older siblings, Max and Elsa, and their families. The Cologne had, I don't know, over 10,000 Jews and 7 synagogues, I believe, so a very large Jewish community. And you, as an individual, can go to the archives and say, I want to sponsor. This isn't for your own family. This is Germans do this. I want to sponsor a Stolperstein for somebody. I think it's 120 euros, about $125, $130 in US dollars to install one. And they'll tell you the history of that person and when the Stolperstein's being installed. So we found that very amazing. A family was there, maybe 5 or 7 people were there at the installation of Max Zelenka's family, Stolpersteine, and someone had given the family, someone said, I'm giving our family a Stolperstein or 2, I don't know how, for Christmas. And then this was, in February, they were laying the Stolpersteins, and these people were there. And they knew a little bit about the person, and that was, again, this individualization.
And so these are current generations confronting this history.
Right. It's a wonderful way to deal with it. So anyway, how do you do it? So the first thing that has to happen in a community is the city council or the local authorities have to approve the installation. I should say my knowledge is really about Germany. I really am not sure about other countries. They exist in the other countries, but I didn't have family in those countries eligible. I haven't dealt with that. So it's really about Germany. But In Germany, the city council typically approves that Stolpersteine can be laid because it's in public property. It's in the sidewalk in front of a home or a business. And some businesses may not want that because, and we've had that happened in mine, not with my family, but there was a situation where they had laid a Stolpersteine, and then I heard from the teachers and the principal, the owner wasn't happy because he felt people are going to think, it was a business, an optical store or something, optician, people are going to think my family was Nazis, which wasn't the case. But he worried about that, and I don't think anything came of it in terms of like the Stolpersteine are still there. But there is, some people have some resistance for that. So the Stolpersteine can be sponsored by an archive, as in Cologne. They can be sponsored by a school like in Mayan. It can be the Jewish community. It can be a corporation. Anybody can sponsor one. If you're interested, if someone knows, I had family who are eligible, the best place to go, the two places I would recommend is the archives for that city, and you can write them if you Google them and find it and write them in English, they'll probably get a response, or the Stolpersteine website, and there you can switch it from German to English, and everything's in English. They were very helpful too. On occasion, I would ask them questions. And then you could tell the archive or the Stolpersteine, I have this family member from Frankfurt or wherever, and they are eligible for Stolpersteine. What do I do? And again, because it's localized, the Stolpersteine organization could probably direct you to the archives or to their history clubs, I guess is the best translation. They get involved. I'm working with one in northern Germany for my grandfather's family, for my grandfather's oldest brother and his wife did not survive the Holocaust, and I'm working with them to see if we can get Stolpersteine in that sort of small community.
So at this point, how many members of your family have Stolpersteine?
Let's see, I'd say over 20, maybe 24, 25 on both sides. And I should say, as I started to research it, I found some were already installed on my grandfather's side. And I don't know how. For some of them I do. I have a cousin, Harry, and he went back to, he survived and his family didn't. He had a very difficult childhood and in a concentration camp and a death march. He survived. He went back before COVID with his daughters to his hometown, and that was very well received. And he helped sponsor a memorial for the small number of, I think, 17 Jews there, and they also put in Stolpersteine. So I know that happened through his connection directly with the community. But my grandfather had a sister in Dortmund, and there's Stolpersteine there, and I don't know how that happened, but they're there. So sometimes it's a matter of researching, and you have to research locally because it's so localized. There isn't a master file with all Stolpersteine for all of, say, Germany.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. So it may take a little digging.
It's a little digging, but people, yes, the Stolpersteine organization will respond and will help you. We'll put you in touch with people.
Amazing. And so when you've gone to a few of the dedications, I'm sure also traveled to see the ones that had been previously laid. What does it look like when one is dedicated?
Mm-hmm. So I've been to dedications in my grandmother's hometown, my father's hometown of Mayan, and that was sponsored by the school. And so it was a big ceremony. The students were very involved. This was the wonderful thing about the experience that we've had in Mayan, is they did research of working with the archives. The archives gave the students a list of names, and they researched the history. Some of them were researching my family, so they reached out to us about that our family, and we could provide artifacts. A very meaningful thing for me is last summer my father had a Zoom conversation with the students and was able to tell the story, Kristallnacht, growing up, what happened. and answer their questions. And they, it's their history too. Germans have to deal with it, just like, the perpetrators' descendants have to deal with it, just like the victims' descendants, or not just like, but also. And so it's very meaningful for them to have, just as we appreciate having the survivors talk, they appreciate it. I just had an email from the teacher last month saying they're still talking about it. Still very meaningful for them.
And I know it's always wonderful when you've spoken on this topic for our Descendants programming. I know your dad really wanted to zoom in, so I appreciate how much he is so much about educating and raising awareness. Exactly. And so that's so beautiful he was able to speak to the students. What has this meant for your family as a whole, knowing that individuals are being remembered, will always be remembered in this way, and also taking part in these? What has it been like for you and your family?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just the ceremony was so meaningful, and we videotaped it so my family could see some of that. My father could see some of that. So in Mayan, they had a ceremony at the school. The mayor spoke, the principal spoke, the teacher spoke, some students spoke. I spoke, my cousin Judy, Paul's daughter, spoke as well, and it was a ceremony, and then we went to the different locations, 4 or 5 locations each year, because we did it in 23 and 24. In 23, we did it for my family. It was that home I talked about with Edward, my great-grandfather, and Marta and her husband and children. They did 5 stones there. In 24, it was my grandparents, and my Uncle Paul and my father received them in front of their home. So that was, you go around and do that. But the ceremony was really special, and it was well attended. Lots of students, people from the community. There was newspaper reporting on it, and very favorable. In Cologne, I think it's more common that they have them regularly because there's so many. And as I said, there was a little ceremony at the location, each location, and then Kunterdemning sort of moves on to the next location. The special thing for us, and when we did this in Cologne last February, was my grandmother's nephew Bernhard, whom I mentioned was the survivor. His daughter and granddaughter were able to come on that trip with us and participate in the Stolpersteine installation in front of their family home. And then what was really cool was that's now rental property, and someone who rents an apartment there came out and said, "Would you like to come in and see where your family lived?" And so that was amazing. It was interesting because my father had visited there as a 5-year-old and sort of remembered it and was describing it. So it's really a very moving. But and my cousin Debbie gave a speech. It was a smaller group, but she gave a speech at the Stolpersteine for her family and what it meant to her.
Well, I very much appreciate you sharing about your family story, especially because it has such sad aspects, and but you so beautifully are keeping those memories alive. And also thank you for sharing about this special project, and hopefully other people who want to look into it can also look into honoring their family and remembering their family this way. So thank you for being my guest today and sharing both aspects of this history with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling and is generously supported by Margaret and Michael Valentine. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kik Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati, Ohio.